Well, hey there, folks. Now, I know what you're thinking. Here goes another gun guy claiming one single firearm won the West, like it's some kind of magical freedom wand that tamed the frontier all by itself. But here's the thing, and this might surprise you, the Colt Single Action Army wasn't even the most popular revolver of its time. That honor went to some forgotten Harrington and Richardson piece that sold 3 million units, while most folks today couldn't pick one up out of a lineup if their life depended on it. But, and this is where it gets interesting, there's a reason we're not making videos about H&R, and there's a reason every cowboy movie, every Western video game, every kid playing with cap guns reaches for something that looks exactly like a Colt Peacemaker. Because while other guns might have sold more, Single Action Army didn't just arm the West, it defined it. And by the time I'm done telling you this story, you're going to understand why this particular six-shooter became the most iconic handgun in American history, and why after 150 years you can still walk into a gun store today and buy the exact same gun that rode with Teddy Roosevelt up San Juan Hill. Now, real quick, before we dive into the meat and potatoes of this iron legend, let me paint you a picture of what the American West was like when this beauty first rolled off the production line in 1873. We're talking about a time when law enforcement was spread thinner than butter on burnt toast. Sheriffs and their deputies were trying to keep order in an era of shootouts, not to mention legendary outlaws we still make movies about today, and Native American raiding parties defending their homeland, plus some blood feuds that could stretch on for years. The Civil War had ended in 1865, but the nation was still licking its wounds, trying to figure out what the heck it wanted to be when it grew up. Out west, things were even more complicated. You had white settlers pushing into territories that belonged to native tribes who, and I definitely cannot blame them for this, were absolutely furious about having their land stolen out from under them. Then you had your garden variety troublemakers, cattle rustlers, armed robbers, claim jumpers, and the kind of folks who'd shoot you in the back for the contents of your saddlebags. It was a time and place where fortunes could be made overnight and you could lose everything, including your life, just as fast. This was a world that needed a reliable, powerful, no-nonsense firearm. And that's exactly what Samuel Colt's company was about to deliver. Now, here's a fun fact. The man who created the most famous gun in the American West was born and died about as far as cowboy country as you could get, right there in Hartford, Connecticut. Samuel Colt was a Yankee through and through, but he had the vision to create something that would become synonymous with a frontier spirit. Story goes that young Sam got his inspiration for a revolving cylinder while he was on a ship headed to India, watching the ship's wheel turn and lock into position. Now, he was just 16 or 17 years old, probably seasick as a dog, but he had the presence of mind to carve a wooden model of his idea right there on the deck. Now, Colt wasn't the first guy to think of a revolving cylinder. That honor goes to some other forgotten genius, but he was the first to make it actually work reliably and mass produce it. His early revolvers used interchangeable parts, which was revolutionary for that time. Instead of having some old gunsmith hand-fit every piece, Colt could crank these things out on what passed for an assembly line in the 1830s. But here's the kicker. Sam Colt died in 1862, a full 11 years before his most famous creation ever saw the light of day. The man made a fortune off his early revolvers, leaving behind about 15 million, and that's 385 million in today's money. But he never lived to see the gun that would make his name immortal. So if Sam Colt was pushing up daisies by 1862, who the heck actually created the Single Action Army? Well, that honor goes to two of his finest engineers, William Mason and Charles Brinkerhoff Richards. These boys have been tasked with creating the next evolution of the Colt revolver, and they knocked it out of the park. But they had a problem. See, there was this patent held by a fellow named Roland White that basically locked up the rights to bore cylinders all the way through so you could load cartridges from the rear. White was more aggressive about defending his patent than a mama bear protecting her cub, so Colt couldn't touch that design until it expired in 1869. The minute that patent expired, Mason and Richards got to work. What they came up with was initially called the New Model Army Metallic Cartridge Revolving Pistol. And thank goodness that name didn't stick, and it hit the market in 1873 as the Colt Single Action Army. The U.S. Army put it through trials in 1872, and it impressed them enough that they placed an order for 8,000 units at $13 each. Over the next 20 years, the military would buy 38,000 of these revolvers, and every single one of them was chambered in a brand new cartridge that Colt developed specifically for this gun, the .45 Colt. But let's talk about that cartridge for a minute, because this is where things get really interesting. Colt worked with Union Metallic Cartridge Company to develop a round that would make most of their new revolver's capabilities. The original military load pushed a 255-grain lead bullet over 40 grains of black powder generating over 1,000 feet per second out of that 7.5-inch barrel. That is serious power, folks. Enough to drop a horse if you had to, or punch through the kind of heavy clothing and gear that might stop a smaller round. But that's not even the part that'll blow your mind. The original .45 Colt loading became the template for one of the most famous gun cartridges in history. When John Moses Browning designed the .45 ACP for his 1911 pistol, he basically took the .45 Colt's ballistics and stuffed them into a shorter case. Same 230 grain bullet, same similar feet per second. The .45 ACP is essentially the .45 Colt's little brother. The government rounds were loaded by Frankfurt Arsenal. They used a weird internal priming system that made them look almost like a rimfire cartridge, and the cases were soft copper, which caused some problems, but the round was effective enough that it remained in standard military cartridge until 1892. But alright, let's get down to the nitty-gritty of what made the revolver so special. Single Action Army was built like a brick outhouse and twice as reliable. First off, it used a top strap frame design, which made it significantly stronger than open-top revolvers that came before it. Top strap distributed the stress of firing across the entire frame instead of just concentrating at a few weak points. This wasn't just engineering improvement, this was a quantum leap in revolver design. The action itself was beautifully simple. It used basically the same lockwork as Colt's earlier percussion revolvers, the Dragoons, the 1851 Navy, and the 1860 Army, just adapted for metallic cartridges. Simple meant reliable, and reliable meant that you could count on it when your life was on the line. The famous plow handle grip wasn't just distinctive looking, it was ergonomically brilliant. The gun pointed naturally, like it was an extension of your hand. Whether you were using the fancy adjustable sights or just point shooting, the Single Action Army felt right in a way that's kind of hard to describe, but impossible to forget once you've experienced it. The standard Army model came with a 7.5-inch barrel, which they called the cavalry, even though all the branches of the service did use it. But civilians could get it in a different barrel length, including 5.5 inches, the artillery length, 4 3/4 inches, the civilian or gunfighter length, and even shorter sheriff's models without ejector rod housings for easier concealment. Now here's where Colt showed their business savvy. They didn't just make one gun and call it a day, they made variations for every possible customer. The sheriff's model, also called the shopkeeper's or storekeeper's model, had no ejector rod housing at all. The frame was the same on both sides, smooth as a baby's bottom. These right here were made for concealment. While you might think they were all snub-nosed belly guns, you'd be wrong. The most popular sheriff's models had a 4-inch barrel, and believe it or not, 3% of them were made with 7.5-inch barrels. Try concealing that under your vest. Then there was a flat-top target model, produced from 1888 to 96. Only about 900 of these were ever made, which makes them rarer than a hen's teeth today. Instead of normal curved top straps, these had flat frames, the dovetailed rear sight, fancy front sights soldered onto a block on the barrel. Many of these were chambered in .44 Russian, which was considered one of the most accurate cartridges of the 19th century. Now, the Bisley model, introduced in 1894, was named after the famous shooting range in England. It had a completely different grip angle, a low-slung hammer, and a curved trigger. The whole gun was redesigned for target shooting, faster lock-on time, and better balance. Interestingly enough, a lot of folks bought these not for target work, but for concealed carry, figuring that low hammer profile would snag less when you needed to draw fast. Now, over its production life, the Single Action Army was chambered for more than 30 different cartridges. The big five in order of popularity were number 1 in the .45 Colt, obviously, 158,884 produced, the original and still the champion. Number 2 is the .44-40 Winchester, 71,392 made. This was brilliant marketing by Colt. The .44-40 was still a popular rifle cartridge, so cowboys could carry one type of ammo for both their rifle and their sidearm. The .38-40 Winchester comes in at number 3 with 50,520 produced. Same idea as the .44-40, just in a smaller package. At number 4, we got the .32-20 Winchester, 43,284 made. The little brother of the Winchester family. And finally, at number 5, the .41 Colt, 19,676 made. This was essentially the .38 Special of the 19th century with similar ballistics and power. But Colt would chamber these guns in, well, just about anything that would fit in the cylinder, from 22 rimfire all the way up to 476 LA. If you had money and the patience, Colt would build you whatever the heck you wanted. But let's talk about some of the famous folks who carried these iron legends, because the Single Action Army attracted quite a cast of characters. Bat Masterson was probably the most famous civilian user. He ordered the guns directly from Colt, specifying he wanted the barrel the same length as the injector rod housing at 4 3/4 inches. and he wanted the trigger on the light side. Bat knew what he wanted. He wasn't shy about asking for it. But here's a funny story about old Bat. Later in life, when he was working as a sports writer in New York City, he'd occasionally need some drinking money. So he'd go to a pawn shop, buy some beat-up old Colt for a couple bucks, file some notches in the grips, and sell it as the gun Bat Masterson carried in Dodge City. The man was an entrepreneur right till the end. Theodore Roosevelt carried a Colt Single Action Army when he led his Rough Riders up San Juan Hill in 1898. Even as president, he kept that gun close, understanding that it represented something fundamental about American character and determination. General George Patton was famous for his ivory-handled single-action army, which he carried throughout World War II. There's a great story about a young Lieutenant Patton in 1916 during the expedition into Mexico to hunt for Pancho Villa. Patton and his men stumbled upon one of Villa's captains, Julio Cardenas, and in the ensuing gunfight, Patton blazed away with his trusty Colt. It was the first motorized military action in U.S. history. They were using Dodge touring cars, but Patton, he was still packing iron that would have been familiar to any cowboy from 30 years earlier. Legend says Patton carved 2 notches in his gun grips to commemorate the men he killed that day, though historians still argue about who actually fired the fatal shots. Speaking of famous gunmen, we can't talk about the most famous single-action army shootout without mentioning the biggest one in history. On October 26, 1881, in Tombstone, Arizona, the Earp brothers and Doc Holliday faced off against the Clanton and McClary gang that became known as the gunfight at the OK Corral. Here's the thing, it didn't actually happen at the OK Corral. It happened next to the C.S. Fly's photography studio on Fremont Street, but the gunfight next to Fly's photography studio doesn't quite have the same ring to it, does it? This fight here lasted about 30 seconds, with roughly 30 shots fired. 3 of the outlaws ended up dead, and according to witnesses, every single gun that fired that day was a Colt Single Action Army. When the smoke cleared, the Peacemaker had lived up to its ironic nickname. It brought peace to Tombstone, at least temporarily. And the Single Action Army had gone through 3 distinct generations of production. Each tells a story about American manufacturing and culture. The first generation was 1873 to 1940. This was the original run. Now during this period, 357,000 revolvers were produced, with half of them made before 1900. This was when all the major design changes happened. The switch from wrought iron to steel frames in 1883, the change from one-piece walnut grips to 2-piece hard rubber grips in 1881, and the certification for smokeless powder around 1898. Production stopped in 1940 not because the gun was obsolete, but because Colt needed to clear out the old machinery to make room for wartime production. Tooling was literally worn out after nearly 70 years of continuous use. And that brings us to the second generation, which was 1956 to 1974. Happened because of TV westerns, shows like Gunsmoke, Bonanza, and The Rifleman created a huge demand for authentic-looking single-action army revolvers. Other companies like Great Western and Ruger jumped into the market, so Colt dusted off their old tooling and made sure that Peacemakers were on the market again. Many collectors consider the second-generation guns to be the finest Colts ever made. The quality control here was exceptional. The fit and finish were superb, and they shot like a dream. Only about 73,000 of these were made during this 18-year period. And that brings me to the third generation in 1976 to present day. Now this began when Colt had to completely retool again. The old machinery was finally beyond repair, so they invested in new equipment and started fresh. The public immediately noticed that these new guns were subtly different. They still looked like Colts, sounded like Colts, and functioned like Colts, but they weren't quite the same. Some manufacturing shortcuts have been introduced to keep costs down. The early third-generation guns, especially those from the late 1980s and early 1990s, had a reputation for rough actions that felt like they were full of sand. Colt's attitude at the time was basically, nobody's going to shoot these anyway, they're investments. Well, that didn't sit well with folks who actually wanted to use their guns, so by the late 1990s, Colt had gotten the message and improved their quality control significantly. Today's third-generation single-action armies are made by Colt's custom shop and are excellent firearms, though they'll cost you a pretty penny. But now, if we're talking about who really cemented the single-action army's place in American mythology, we gotta tip our hats to William Frederick Cody, aka Buffalo Bill. The man was a larger-than-life in every sense of the words. Medal of Honor recipient, scout, hunter, and he supposedly killed 4,282 buffalo in 18 months, and showman extraordinaire. In 1883, he created Buffalo Bill's Wild West, a traveling show that was part circus, part history lesson, and part American mythology factory. Buffalo Bill's show toured internationally and was a massive success. At the center of it all was, well, Buffalo Bill himself, his flowing hair, fringed buckskins, and treasured Colt Single Action Army. This is probably where the phrase, "the gun that won the West," first appeared, and Buffalo Bill's showmanship did more to cement the Peacemaker's legendary status than any marketing campaign ever could. The show ran for decades and reached millions of people who would never see the real American West. For them, Buffalo Bill's Colt represented everything romantic and adventurous about that frontier. It was authentic American mythology, and it worked like gangbusters. But let's get back to why this gun actually succeeded beyond all that good marketing. Single Action Army had several technical advantages that made it superior to its competition. First, that solid top strap frame I mentioned earlier wasn't just stronger, it was also more accurate. The rigid frame provided a consistent platform for the barrel, which meant better shot-to-shot consistency. Second, the timing was perfect. The cylinder locked up tight when the hammer was cocked with minimal play or wiggle, meaning the chamber aligned precisely with the barrel every single time, which is, well, pretty crucial for accuracy. And third, the trigger was a thing of beauty. Single action triggers can be made much lighter and crisper than the double action triggers because they only gotta do one job, release the hammer. A good Single Action Army trigger breaks like a glass rod with no creep or over travel. And fourth, the sights were actually pretty dang good for the era. The rear sight was a simple groove in the top strap and the front sight was a blade. Simple, robust, effective. On the flat-top target models, you got adjustable sights that were genuinely precise. Now, one thing that separated the Single Action Army from more modern revolvers was the loading and unloading process. This wasn't just a gun you could speed load like a Smith Wesson Schofield with its break-open action. To load a Single Action Army, you had to half-cock the hammer, open the loading gate on the right side of the frame, and insert cartridges in one at a time. To unload, you had to align each chamber with the loading gate and use the ejector rod to push the spent cases out, again, one at a time. This process became almost ritualistic for many users. There's something meditative about the deliberate, methodical loading of a Single Action Army. It forces you to slow down, to be present in the moment. Treat each cartridge with the respect it deserves. Now, sure, it was slower than the more modern designs, but speed ain't everything. The Single Action Army taught us patience and precision, qualities that served its users well in the often unforgiving environment of the frontier. But the Single Action Army didn't just exist in a vacuum. It had plenty of competition. Smith Wesson Schofield was actually adopted by the U.S. Army as a secondary cavalry arm in 1875, and it had some real advantages. You could break it open, eject all 6 spent cases at once, and reload with 6 fresh cartridges in a fraction of the time it took to reload a Colt. But the Schofield had problems too. It used a shorter cartridge that wouldn't work in the Colt, while Colt cartridges were supposedly too long for the Schofield. This created a logistical nightmare for the Army, with units sometimes getting the wrong ammunition for their guns. The Army eventually solved this problem by developing a compromise cartridge in 1882, the model 1882 45 cartridge. But you know, it was a Schofield length but had a rim size that would work in both guns. Obviously, this became the standard military cartridge until the Army switched to 38 caliber double action revolvers in 1892. And despite all of Schofield's speed advantage, the Single Action Army remained more popular with both military and civilian users. Sometimes reliability and familiarity trumped pure performance. By the early 1900s, the Single Action Army had transcended its role as just another firearm. It had become a symbol of American independence, self-reliance, and frontier spirit. When Hollywood started making Western movies, there was never any question about what kind of gun the heroes would carry. The gun appeared in countless films. From those early silent westerns to modern blockbusters, John Wayne made it his signature weapon. Clint Eastwood carried one in the Man with No Name trilogy. Even today, any movie set in the Old West features Single Action Army revolvers prominently. This cultural impact created a feedback loop. The more the gun appeared in popular culture, the more people wanted to own one, which kept Colt in business, and well, that ensured the design would survive into the modern era. So today, 150 years after its introduction, the Colt Single Action Army is still in production. You can walk into a gun store and buy essentially the same gun that Wyatt Earp carried in Tombstone or that Teddy Roosevelt packed up San Juan Hill. Sure, modern manufacturing techniques have improved quality control and consistency, but the same basic design remains unchanged. The grip angle is the same, the balance is the same, the feel is the same. It's a direct link to American history that you can put in your hand. The gun remains popular with cowboy action shooters, collectors, and anyone who appreciates classic American craftsmanship. Modern ammunition has made it more versatile than ever. You can load it up with light target loads for plinking or heavy hunting loads for serious work. So, Why did the Colt Single Action Army really win the West? Well, that is probably an exaggeration. The West was won by railroads, telegraph lines, barbed wire, and sheer determination of millions of ordinary people trying to build better lives for themselves and their families. But if any single firearm can claim that title, it's a Peacemaker. It was there for all the big moments. The Indian Wars, the cattle drives, the mining booms, railroad construction, the establishment of law and order in frontier towns. It was reliable when reliability meant the difference between life and death. Powerful when power was needed, and accurate when accuracy counted. But more than that, it became the symbol of an entire era. When we think of the American West, we think of cowboys and lawmen carrying single-action army revolvers. That image is so deeply embedded in our culture, it's become part of our national identity. The Colt Single Action Army didn't just win the West, it defined what winning the West meant. It represented the idea that a free person could and should be able to defend themselves, their family, and their property. It embodied the frontier values of self-reliance, personal responsibility, and a willingness to stand up for what's right. But there you have it, folks. Story of how a Connecticut Yankees design became the most iconic handgun in American history. From Samuel Colt's inspiration on a ship bound for India to modern reproduction still rolling off the production line today, the Single Action Army has been a constant companion to the American spirit. It's been carried by presidents and outlaws, lawmen and desperados, soldiers and civilians. It's been featured in more movies than any other firearm, inspired countless imitators, and it remains as relevant today as it was 150 years ago. The next time you see a Western movie or you play a cowboy video game, take a moment to appreciate that distinctive silhouette. It's not just a gun you're looking at. It's a piece of American history, a symbol of an era when the country was young and anything seemed possible. And if you ever get the chance to hold a real single-action army, do it. Feel that perfect balance, that solid construction, a connection to our past. You'll understand immediately why this particular six-shooter became the gun that won the West. Now, if you enjoy learning about this legendary firearm, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell. We got plenty more stories about guns that shaped Americans' history, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming up next. Till then, we'll see you on the next one.